Cedar Creek Lake House, Nautilus. Financially we were doing well and I was looking around for an investment outside the stocks and bonds arena. Farms, land, it seems that every investment requires large commitments of time as well as money. What the heck, let's enjoy the investment and shop for a lake house. You would think that I would have learned my lesson when we bought the Stark House, New Mexico. I wanted a small, remote, simple cabin where we could enjoy nature. I took the wife and girls, and we ended up with a 3-level house, dishwasher, clothes washer, dryer, etc. Well, I didn't. After looking at several houses, the women decided that the compound must be able to house all the families at the same time. 5 bedrooms, 5 baths, 2 dishwashers. I love the house, but it ends up that both families are almost never there together. Sports and children's activities even keep the grandkids and our girls' families busy most weekends. Merlene and I and sometimes our friends are the usual inhabitants of the Nautilus. Merlene and the Cadillac SRX. Nothing funny or entertaining about this, but it could have been an even bigger event in our life. In July 2014 she was coming down the Big Hill, leaving Cedar Hill and heading out to visit her sister in Fort Worth. A young woman turned in front of her with no chance of avoiding a collision. I received a call on the golf course from a police officer informing me that my wife had been in an accident. He assured me that there was no reason for alarm, there was no blood, and she was in an ambulance, on the way to Methodist Hospital. As I came up the hill, suddenly, there was the car, and it was totaled. I arrived at the emergency room and there she was, of course, in a neck brace, but seemed to be in fine shape. After all the standard testing, scanning, poking and prodding, we waited for the doctor to give us good health approval. He arrived, smiling, and said that the scans had revealed she had a neck fracture. I am thinking, a small crack, no big deal. Then a little later we are informed that she has 3 broken vertebrae in her neck. In her high school days, she had broken her neck in a car wreck and spent many weeks in traction while suspended by her head in a hospital bed. Here we are now, titanium rods and screws in her neck, with only a small loss in range of motion. She can walk, talk, and boss me around just like the previous Merlene. God is great. Kind of retired or at least with no regular salary. Well, circumstances have caught up with Southland, and the decision of what to do must be made. The business was making more money than we had ever made, but 2 nationwide distributor networks were moving into the southern markets and we were looking at 2 competitors that both had private equity money and deep pockets. We realized this would mean lower margins and lower profit for future sales. Other factors were that our largest vendor, Procter & Gamble, had notified us that we would lose their product lines in the near future because they wanted a single national distributor. We could see the trend that other vendors were looking at single distributor national distribution. Our old competitor Lone Star Pet had sold out to Animal Supply and they were in the process of moving their corporate headquarters to Las Colinas. The former owner of Lone Star, Dennis Stahl, on behalf of Animal Supply had called several times requesting that we talk with the private equity company, Halifax, about selling. We visited, talked, and thanked them, but said no. A few months later, the other national distributor, Philips, called and wanted to talk about selling. About this time, we learned for sure that IAMS was going to drop us as a distributor. We were also facing the prospect that our overhead would be rising because of Obamacare health insurance. We were just over the 50 employee limit and really needed to grow. We finally agreed to go through the due diligence process and haggle over a selling price. It was lower than my expectations and I called back Philips for a competing offer. They were lower than my expectations, but the news leaked to ASC that Philips was bidding and they upped their offer. ASC finally made an offer and agreed to pay about $2 million of that to my 4 senior managers as bonuses when they hired them. The hiring of my employees had been the source of much discussion surrounding their future. The deal was made and I faxed them my signature to the final deal and price. Would you believe that only 1 hour later, Philips called and upped their previous offer by several million? I had left $1 million on the table. I could have probably backed out of the ASC deal, but we really thought ASC would be a better fit for my employees and I had signed and given my word to them. We officially sold it on July 31, 2014. I continued to work as a consultant since I was the only one that could program our base operating systems and programs. This lasted about 6 months, but I had agreed to continue to lease the warehouse to them for 2 years and to keep my office. This is now November 2015 and I have moved my office home. ASC has moved all the personnel except 2 people in the warehouse into their corporate headquarters in Las Colinas. No need to drive to Irving when there are no people to visit with and have lunch. ASC has failed to live up to their promises and plans for the future. They have fired Sievert Nielsen and George Spann, failed to build the giant warehouse in DFW, and have lost several of the vendors that we had passed to them. My money, however, is in the bank, what there is left of it. Over $2 million in bonuses to employees, over $3 million as a gift to the IRS, and a few $100,000 to auditors, CPAs, insurance, etc. Austin's first moto trip. In July 2015, we decided if I was going to do a moto trip with Austin, it was time, even though he had no license. Most of the riding would be off-road and the police had never stopped us in the little towns of Colorado. It would be Austin, Donnie, Randy, and I. Donnie bought a 250 XT Yamaha just like mine for Austin, since he had only a motocross bike. We loaded up and headed for the Stark House. The first day, on a test ride, Randy's bike broke down just outside of Angel Fire and he and I spent the day working on the carburetor. The next morning, we all started out on a week's trail ride in New Mexico and Colorado. First, across the pass to Taos, then across the Rio Grande Canyon Bridge to Tres Rios, cross-country on Jeep roads to Pretoria. We were stopped by a mountain thunderstorm and took shelter in a rustic cabin for the night. Next day, on to Summitville, Salida, and then a big loop north, then west to Cathedral, Deer Lakes, and finally Lake City. Supper and beer at the local bar and later we sat around the outdoor fire at our again, rustic cabin in Lake City. The next day Donnie and Austin did the Engineer Pass to Silverton and returned by Cinnamon Pass. Randy and I have done that loop many times and the old men walked around and sat outside the cabins and watched the motos and ATVs pass by. We spent that night again in Lake City and prepared for an early start in the morning. Return through Lake City, Creed, South Fork, Pretoria, Tres Rios, Taos, and Stark House. Now I can say and Austin can say that we shared a motorcycle trip with each other. New Mexico Backcountry Discovery Route. Randy Cochran, John Lee, Donnie Chick, and Austin Chick, and I set out in early June 2016 to ride the NMBDR from Antonito, Colorado to Del City, Texas. This year we planned to primitive camp part of the time instead of using local motels. Much of our trip planning was spent in assembling camping gear and then, item by item, removing them from the packs. You can only carry so much on an off-road motorcycle. I even purchased a miniature CPAP machine that could run on a lithium battery. Being the appointed leader, I had spent many hours planning the route, times, camping locations, etc. My motorcycle was an 18-year-old Suzuki DR350 that Randy had bought with only 300 miles on the odometer and completely reworked and customized. I purchased the bike from him, knowing that if it broke down, he would feel obligated to do the repairs. It was the same bike that he rode the previous summer when we rode the Colorado Backcountry Discovery Route from Cortez, Colorado almost to Wyoming. That trip was terminated when we decided to race freezing rain and snow back to New Mexico. For the NMBDR we drove to the Stark House and spent the night, rose early and headed out with no problems. Breakfast in Taos, across the Rio Grande to Tres Rios, then refuel and snack for lunch in Antonito, Colorado. First problem of the trip, my helmet lost a screw and started to fall apart. Only one hardware store in town, and amazingly they had a screw that, kind of, worked. Back up the highway a few miles and the south on a dirt road that quickly crossed the old narrow-gauge Cumbers Railroad tracks. It had rained quite a lot the previous week, dried out, and left ruts that tried to buck you off every few yards. The scenery was great and we soon rode along a beautiful mountain river with the sun shining through the aspen at every turn. Austin was on his Yamaha 250 and loved every minute of trail riding. It was a full day of riding through the New Mexico forest and wilderness. Around 5 o'clock we rolled up beside a beautiful meadow with a stream running through it, and a fire ring, and wood that some previous camper had left just for us. We pitched our tents, started a campfire, and spent a couple of hours talking about the day's ride before retiring. We were well above 9,000 feet altitude and it got really cold during the night. John rose early, revived the fire, and we had snacks for breakfast before starting out on a new day of adventure. It was a beautiful forest road which leads to El Rito at the edge of the desert. This is where a section of the route had been advertised as expert. How could we pass up a chance to show our moto prowess, and display our riding ability compared to those posers who ride the big BMWs? We could probably have handled the expert section just fine if I had not lost my way. We wandered about 5 miles off route, crossed a barbed wire fence, and picked our way down the dry gulches for hours. It was miserably hot, we were working hard, and averaging about 2 miles per hour. Finally, we spot the highway in the distance, and there between us and freedom was an iron gate, locked. There was no turning around. Gas was low, Randy was about to pass out from heat exhaustion, and we all were dead tired from the hours of picking our way through the scrub trees, rocks, gullies, and steep downhill terrain. Someone in the near past had the same problem, and the fence by the gate had been cut and twisted back. About the time Donnie had the fence unwired, a SUV came tearing up the highway, pulled in, and a stern-faced cowboy stepped out. We immediately reassured him we were about to rewire the fence after we crossed to the highway. Seeing him step out of the SUV with "Ghost Ranch Manager" on its side, I removed my helmet, hoping to receive some pity for my age and condition. We explained that there was no choice, we were out of gas, and Randy, at this point, was slumped in the small shade of his motorcycle in a stupor. It must have worked, for he just said, "Make sure you do," returned to the SUV and drove off. We repaired the fence, started down the beautiful, smooth, wonderful highway for an easy ride on to Abiquiu. Our crew stumbled into the cafe and filling station for lunch, liquid, and recovery for at least an hour. This place was a lifesaver, but I must say something about the restroom. You have all seen high commodes for the handicapped, but this one must have been made for a handicapped Bigfoot. At 6 foot tall, my feet dangled. No, the day is not over. We passed the Abiquiu Reservoir and down a great mountain road to Teakettle Rock. This is, of course, a natural rock, about the size of a house, shaped like a tea kettle, handle and all. Cuba was our destination for the day. A motel and a great Mexican food restaurant finished the second day on the trail. I hope you aren't getting tired of this account, but it could be the last great adventure for the old crew, Les and Randy. Leaving Cuba, we headed south again on a very sandy, very isolated, desert road headed for Grants. This section has the vast desert vistas like you see in the Old West movies. The riding was easy except where the sand had blown into the ruts, making them invisible, so that you could never quite relax. It was a great section until we arrived in Grants. It was past noon, very hot, and we needed food and drink. After driving every road in town, we finally arrived at an air-conditioned Mexican restaurant for food, drink, and rest, again. John had been carrying all his extra stuff in a backpack that felt like it weighed 70 pounds. He drove off to find a post office and mail the extra goodies back home. He ran out of gas and had to push the bike, in the heat, up the road to a filling station. This was why we sat outside the restaurant waiting. His cell phone was dead also. Sad to say, this was the start of John's problems again this year. On a previous trip, John had a series of flat tires, which cost him money and time, trying to patch the old tire and tube. The crew left Grants in the early afternoon, again headed south on wooded mountain roads. This is where I ate a little, humble pie. I had entered both routes and tracks into my GPS. The route marker is bold and bright and can be seen in bright sunlight, but the track markers are a thin dashed line. I had entered the route incorrectly and we followed a forest trail for a mile or so before realizing it was wrong. I turned back, deciding to follow the track on the GPS. While slumping over, squinting at the GPS, and riding down the primitive trail, a deep rut grabbed my front wheel and slammed me to the earth in a most undignified manner. So much for my riding prowess. My partners rushed over and amazingly picked the bike off my legs without even taking the photos that usually precede any help. The only thing hurt was my pride and a skin shin from the foot peg. About this time, John's bike started backfiring and running funky. The further we got that afternoon, the worse his bike ran. We decided to pull into the El Morro National Monument campground for the night while working on his motorcycle. We set up the tents and John and Randy proceeded to work on the motorcycle. They worked until midnight with no success. The next morning, After trying new fixes, John made the decision to ride Donnie's bike to the nearest rental place and return to Starkhouse while we finished our ride. He left about 10 o'clock and rode to Gallup, rented a U-Haul and returned mid-afternoon. Again, he was the recipient of more than his share of bad luck. He spent the night at Starkhouse that night and then proceeded to drive the U-Haul all the way back to Texas at a cost of about $500. It was late afternoon and we decided to stay in the campground for a second night and start fresh the next morning. Rising early, we packed our tents and headed out southwest to the Navajo Indian Reservation with a quick stop at the Little Pine Grocery. Next stop was at the Candy Kitchen for a late breakfast and then on to Fence Lake. We met a couple of groups of adventure riders who were going the south to north route and had brief hellos and good luck. The Salt Lake is an old volcanic crater that collects water and evaporates out the salt. Pictures were taken, hydration and dehydration completed, and off again for we have miles to go and miles to go. The Luna Grocery is about the only business in Luna, and we were about the only customers that day. The middle-aged lady had to tell us her life story about moving away, marrying, divorcing, and moving back to where she was born. The people you meet out there are much of the memories, along with the ruts. They are rough, real, and always ready to help. Leaving Luna in the late afternoon, we headed up the highway to Reserve to find a motel for the night. The only motel was locked and unattended. There was a sign on the door giving instructions to dial a number into the keypad for the attendant. She was in another town, but took our credit card and a door magically opened in the wall with a room key. We ate at another Mexican restaurant and slept in a good bed that night. We started our 6th day, leaving Reserve and heading for the Chloride Canyon road that had been talked about so much on the ADV Rider forum. The Arizona border had been only a couple of miles from Luna, so now we were headed back to the east. Across the mountain valleys we started to see smoke. It soon became apparent we were headed right into a forest fire. The trees are fairly wide spaced in this part of the mountains, so we advanced till suddenly the ground was smoking on one side of the road and the other side was untouched. It was a little eerie, riding along with trees and ground smoking on one side and everything peaceful on the other side of the road. Early afternoon, we started down the Chloride Canyon road, of which we had read so much about its beauty. It was pretty, but rough, and going downhill made the rocks that much larger, and the heat that much hotter. Our last night on the road would be in Winston. Not really a town, just an intersection with a store. They had a couple of log cabins they rented, and we were ready for food and bed. We drove back to Chloride, an old ghost town at the foot of the canyon where there was a restaurant, we were told. It was in a 100-year-old structure which had been built when the chloride mine was up and running. We had to rouse the two ladies from the trailer out back to cook for us that evening. The food was great and the service even better. What more could you ask for than a young military wife, living with her mother, while her husband was in Afghanistan, standing by your table, waiting for someone to say something, so that she could join the conversation. They were obviously lonely for conversation, stuck out here in a ghost town. Leaving Winston, we hit the 2-lane highway, winding through the mountains, and decided to end our trip and head for Starkhouse. Riding east to Truth or Consequences, then heading north to Bernardo, then east to Mountain Air and Encino. At Encino we pulled into the only open business in town, for it looked like they were serving food at their grand opening. We joined about 20 locals and had a burger and drinks. Donnie, being the outgoing person he is, had engaged a man who was dressed as a cowboy, but a well-dressed cowboy. His wife, who also seemed out of place among the locals, was carrying on a long conversation with Austin. She spent the half hour or so talking solely with Austin about I know not what, he being 16 and her a good 40. As we were leaving, she ran across the rock parking lot and asked Austin for his email and social networking addresses. Had he found a cougar, or is he just charming like his dad? Later, I was told that he was a New Mexico state senator just out politicking at the grand opening out in the desert. From there, we headed north on Highway 3 and on to Highway 25 to Las Vegas. On entering Las Vegas, the bottom dropped out and we all got soaking wet. Heading out of town, the weather cleared and our last leg, northwest to Angel Fire, was pleasant. We were tired, enjoyed a meal at Zebediah's, and spent our final night of the trip in our beds at Starkhouse. The mileage for the trip was about 1,300 miles, and much of that was on mountain roads. After rereading this, it seems that I talked a lot about hardships, problems, heat, ruts, etc. If you have traveled much, especially on a motorcycle, you know that these are the things you remember. How many times can you tell someone about the beauty of the trees, the vistas, the wildlife, the sheer joy of riding with the wind in your face, on a road never ridden? So, yes, it was a wonderful trip, and hopefully it is not the last for us old moto riders.